Hello and welcome to another episode of the Sketchwave, our weekly show here on YouTube where we talk all things digital art because we are both digital artists here on the platform of YouTube, primarily in the Procreate space. My name is Joel, otherwise known as JoelCreate, and my co-host, as always, is the one and only James Julier. James, how are you, mate?
Yeah, I'm very good. It's been a tiring few days. We went to a little mini festival with the kids,
Oh, yeah.
which was great fun. But yeah, I feel like I'm a bit behind with my sleep and other things. So, how about yourself? Did you have a good week?
Yeah, good weekend. Some friends of ours are back from 2 year sort of jobs, 2 year job over in China, so they've come back now, which is cool. So we've got to see them, which
Nice.
is nice, and some nice surprises as well when they came back. So yeah, it's good to
Yeah.
get everybody together as well. And yeah, just I've been a bit behind on my second channel this week, so I was trying to catch up a little bit on that kind of content. But for me, luckily, that's just like almost redoing YouTube tutorials, but in different apps and stuff. So yeah,
Got
just
you.
playing a bit of
Yes.
catch up really. And talking about
Very good.
tutorials, our main kind of topic today, a little bit of a light-hearted one. We've talked so much about AI. We've spoke about being a YouTuber and the commitments to that and everything like that. We wanted to just maybe have like a little bit more fun this week, and we've gone off since last week's call, and we have found our favorite 5 tutorials that we've released, whether they're on YouTube or Patreon or anywhere else for that matter, and we've collected them together. Now, if you are somebody who consumes this podcast or show, shall I say, typically in a podcast form, in audio form in your car, this particular episode is going to have a lot of nods to visual elements because we're going to be putting a lot of the tutorials on screen, and we're just going to be kind of breaking them down a little bit, give our thoughts behind it, and yeah, just kind of go through our top 5 and the reasons why. So again, if you're listening in your car, potentially maybe save this one until you get home so you can take a look through them. I'm going to start with your 5th one, James,
Right.
which is which is a mountain scene.
Yes.
That well, do you want to describe it first of all for the viewers?
Yeah. One of my most popular videos is not the one I'm about to talk about, but it's one that was quite a few years old, and it ranks as one of my in fact, my most viewed video. So inevitably, you kind of think, well, I could do better now, because when I look back at that one, the detail just isn't there. If you zoom in at all, it looks shockingly bad to my mind. So I
You're
thought I'd
so
do something.
critical,
Well,
so
it's difficult
critical.
not to be as an artist. I think we're
It's
here
true.
as teachers, and you hold yourself to a high standard, really, because you're representing yourself as somebody who can teach and pass on, hopefully a good level of skill. So on this image, I wanted to kind of redo, not exactly the same, but a similar kind of subject matter where we've got maybe distant mountains, then a sort of tree level, and textures, a bit of land, and then that kind of reflected in the water. And so I decided to go for a slightly more muted color palette for this one, which I thought was a little bit more sophisticated. But primarily, I wanted to really get the texture of the trees looking sharper and just a bit more refined than I had done previously. On the one that has got, loads and loads of views, if you zoom into the trees, they just look like spider legs all scrunched up together. They're really not nice to look at. It's completely scribbled. Whereas on this one, I was really quite pleased with that they have a variation of different tree types and shapes and widths, and they do hold up to a little bit of scrutiny. I have actually printed this off, only on A4, but it looks decent when you print it off, and you could
Mm.
easily be something you put in a frame. And don't get me wrong, if you zoom in a great deal, then you start to see the kind of the actual brushes that I've used. But still, it doesn't look like bad drawing. It looks like, okay, you can see the limitations of the brushes that have been used on it instead, which is much better than the kind of the older landscape that I was talking about.
One thing I
Um,
think you do really well in this one, you said about the palette, even though you've kind of gone for the more muted tone, it looks more realistic, I think, in that sense, because
yeah.
you've nothing is super vibrant and punchy all the time, is it? And these ones just give off a real, realistic view. You say about the trees, is that a particular brush then that you're using for the trees in there? Is that like a
Now,
leatherwood or something?
I think it is you putting me back now to try and remember all of the brushes. Within the artistic, you bear with me. I know it's in the artistic brushes. I'll just quickly look now. So within artistic, I think it was the Aurora brush,
Okay.
um, which sounds unlikely, but when it is actually all condensed together, let me just reset it. I'm pretty sure it was that one, yeah. So I used the Aurora brush, and I might have used a combination of that and the Leatherwood brush as well. But then I also put the alpha lock on once I'd actually created the kind of silhouette or the main outline of the tree, and then with the alpha lock on, continue to sort of more roughly and gesturally use that brush. I think the Aurora brush to bring out some more textures within that outline of a shape as well, which is something I've not done before. What I tended to do before was try and attempt to draw every single branch and you know, and it was so time consuming
Mm.
that it just became a little bit of a pain. Whereas this method, you know, you could even draw the tree trunk with the Aurora brush, as long as it's a very small brush, um, and then just sort of like kick out, rock sort of left and right, and build up the overall shape, alpha lock on, and back into it with that. And it wasn't a terribly long process. And then I would copy and paste to create different layers, and then use the transform to kind of create different versions of it as well. So although there's a lot of trees there, it wasn't as time consuming as it actually appears. In terms of the mountains and stuff in the background, they're quite rough still, and a little bit using the Gaussian blur just to knock them back and make them a little less crisp. But yeah, the trees were the thing I really wanted to get to grips with, and I feel that works better in that respect.
One thing I think you always do really well is you manage to you say about the content in the background. You've still managed to show a lot of context there as well, though, like all of the different ledges to the mountains, the tree lines in there. There's quite a lot of detail with it, just having quite muted palette as well, which I think you again like you always do very well in your tutorials. Now this is
Thank
actually
you.
part of a two-parter, isn't it? Because you've got
It
one
is.
without a part of the scene. You carry on with the sort of description of that.
Yeah. So, I mean, sometimes I try to do, I mean, initially I was thinking, how can I do extended versions? This is one of the first extended versions I did on my Patreon. So I was trying to break images down and think, well, what can I offer as an extension? What would be suitable? How can it be a finished image? And I still offer something new over at Patreon. And this seemed like an appropriate one. This was basically the kind of image, like I was saying, that I'd created before, in terms of being a very popular one. But then I decided to add kind of stone textures and features in the water. So I've done the reflection of the whole image on the first one, but then I've added ripples in the water, and I've added a kind of like a bay or like a lake with a shore of sorts, with lots of different kind of stone textures in there. And I was really pleased with the method on this one. If I mean, again, you know, it zooms into a point and it kind of works. It has limitations. All of our digital work, I think, has limitations. Just like if you were using a real paint and a real brush on canvas, I think canvas texture can be more forgiving because you don't get the absolute uh, crispness of the brush strokes on a canvas, because the canvas texture itself kind of consumes that and distorts it and softens it. Um, but with these ones, I think I generally would create like a kind of lozenge shape, and then I think it was the rad brush, and I would just create some really angular forms within it, and then I would multiply that and have them spaced apart, and then I would flatten those layers, and then I multiply it and multiply it and flatten the layers, and just it was a process that just built and built and built the kind of effect, really. And sure, I've
Okay.
added a few different colors through there as well, just to give it a little bit more variety. But the process of creating a few shapes and then just distorting them and layering them, just I was really quite happy with the overall look of that one.
Yeah, it looks great. I mean, again, the level of detail there from start to finish is awesome. And the stones,
Thank you.
they do really make the piece as well. They like bring it all together. I think I've got a tutorial which is somewhat similar in the sense that the land is in the distance and there's water below. And the second we sent these through to each other, I could see how, hang on, that's actually a really good idea to then even add either second part or, in future,
Yeah,
make sure to do that. And I think sometimes we love reflections, don't we? Like people love
sure.
sky and people love reflections, and I think sometimes maybe give them too much space at times when they're not really necessary, when we've got extra elements. So something like this brings the scene to like another level, and depth to it as well, from small stones in front of you way into the back at that mountain in the center as well. So yeah, it's a really lovely piece. Well done.
Yeah, I was quite happy with that one in the end. I wished that hadn't made it a Patreon exclusive and it had all been on YouTube, but it is what it is. And we're picking videos that aren't necessarily our most popular ones here as well.
Yeah.
Um, the actual original one, it did okay on YouTube, but nothing like as much as the one I was trying to outdo, as it turns out. But yeah, I think the extended version makes it a worthwhile tutorial to do. So what about your fifth one then? So we're looking at your work as well. So let's
Yeah,
start your fifth.
this one's a micro world. It's actually a style that there's a Photoshop artist who's really, it's stunning work on some of these different scenes, different landscapes, all sorts of things. The layer of rock potentially top to bottom, and I was just inspired to do one. Something like this uses a lot of photography though. And you would not believe the time it takes to go through hundreds of photos on like Pexels or Unsplash or anything like that, the royalty free sites, just scrolling and scrolling through content, because that's typically how a lot of these tend to go together. It's just a blending, and with subtle sort of techniques to try and sort of blend them together for each layer, because you have the top surface, the left side, right side, as you'll be able to see on screen, and then just picking where's your lighting angle and just setting the basic cube up as such for those different layers, and then giving each one just something, some sort of element. And the concept really is that you've kind of taken a piece of land and you've cut straight through it, but not to allow the land to then drift apart. It's quite literally you've taken like a cutout of a square, and then you can just sort of see through from a side view. People do it. I've got a second one as well, which this one's obviously a koi fish pond. I've got a second one which was it was an ocean and beach and a plane in the sky, which was really nice because then you had like a higher raised element. But this one I really liked just because of the koi fish. I just think they looked really cool. The lighting looked really nice on them and matched the aesthetic. And they're really fun, even though they take a lot of time to put together. They're really fun from the point of view of, okay, you find an image and you may only use like 5% of that image, and then you can just go ahead and cut that out, put it into the design, and you make so many more cuts than it actually shows. Like the rock on the back area there, I think is split into two, and I think for a lot of people that do these, they don't realize how much you can get away with by warping, because a lot of people don't know what those images looked like initially. So for you to just warp it and squeeze it in how you need it to kind of cover up the scene, you can get away with a lot. You can hide quite a lot, layer things on, and there's a very small amount of drawing to it. There's not a lot, if I'm honest. The palette, I think I remember, had only like a handful of colors, just small things like just adding a little bit of color on top for lighting direction, a little bit to the water, but all in all, I think this one was a Patreon exclusive one, and I just had so much fun with it. And it's so fun that Procreate, you can do everything from your mountain design there through to a micro world, and everything in between as well. So
yeah, it's very much like a Photoshop, isn't it? You're not limited to only drawing and painting. You can manipulate images in all sorts of ways, can't you?
Yeah, definitely. So moving on to number 4,
just going back to that one in terms of, I was just going to say, because you say there's not necessarily a lot of drawing, but I think that that belies the amount of kind of knowledge and skill put into just making sure that everything kind of feels natural when it's all placed together. I think that actually you could do that really badly. I think that, okay, you found, photographic images and it's about placing them just so, but I think that you need to understand lighting and shadow and the way that forms actually fit together. So, people are welcome to just have a go at it, but I think your tutorial is probably, crucial in order to show them how that actually these kind of things can be placed together successfully.
Yeah,
Isn't it called an
isometric as well?
Isometric block. It reminds me of old, that angle where you do 3D drawings is on isometric paper, I seem to remember.
Yeah, it would definitely fit that mold. And like you were saying just a second ago, like I think there's certain elements in there, like the stone on the sides, it's like a cool gray. But I think from memory, I think it goes in as like a brown tone. Like we can use
Right.
all the adjustment sliders, etc., in Procreate to manipulate the image to fit as well. So there's other things you kind of have to learn of, like, even though the color in the original photo doesn't match your concept, can you make it fit your concept?
Sure.
Is the data in the photo enough that you can say, actually, with a few tweaks, this would actually work? So yeah, you
Well,
can
it's
you
really
can
nice.
definitely, yeah, thank you. You can definitely have really, really good fun with that type of style. Moving into a style that I've actually never seen on your channel, and when I think of James Julier tutorials, it's always like, beautiful mountains and landscapes. But your fourth place is an iris, an eye design.
Yes. Well, I've actually, I mean, I do, in terms of the work that I do myself, I do tend to preference things rather than people. So I like landscapes and forms and objects. Um, but one of the things, I think, just because it doesn't require me to draw the whole face, something I've really been fascinated in, is the human eye. And just because the colors and textures are quite abstract on the iris, I quite like the freedom that it gives you to really play around with that. And so I have, since I was a teenager, drawn the iris and the eye quite a lot of times, really. I did do it again. I tend to repeat some of my older tutorials a little bit. I did one quite a number of years ago that didn't necessarily get great numbers in terms of views, but it was just one that I enjoyed the subject matter of. So I was going to outdo that and do a much more realistic and detailed version of the tutorial. Now, it's a two-parter. I think in some ways that perhaps limited its appeal. I think whenever you do a two-parter tutorial, you lose half the audience and don't transfer across to the second half of that two-parter. I think in some ways it would have been better had I condensed them both into one really long tutorial, but that's a
Mm.
YouTuber concern. In terms of the art, um, I really enjoyed creating something that was highly detailed and really getting into the tiniest of little details in terms of the iris, and then zooming out and it being a smaller part of a bigger image of the eye. Um, I just love the opportunity to really create something that has this sense of illusion to it, and just because I think it was something a bit different compared to a lot
Mm.
of my other videos. I have done a little less so recently, but certainly in the earlier days of my channel, I do things like flames and fire and um, ice, and I do like texture spheres, and I've even done a human face drawing and skeleton skulls and these kind of things. Um, so yeah, just occasionally I like to throw in a different type of subject matter. I really love drawing the human eye, and it was quite a technical thing, quite a lot of um, technique and proportions necessary in order to teach this. Because if you don't get everything quite lined up, it's not going to look like a successful human eye. Just to the gradient, the kind of curve that goes over the top of the iris, and how much it skims it at the top, and maybe leaving a little gap for the curve of the eyelid underneath. It all just needs to be exactly so. But it's
Mm.
one that I've seen quite a number of people replicate and do. And whenever I see their version, I'm really pleased with what they've done as well. So that's for me a sign of a good tutorial when people have replicated it, and I like what they have produced, and they have produced something that that really stands up to that level of scrutiny, regardless of whether the fact it's done well as a video in terms of numbers. I mean, it's not done badly. It is gradually over time cranked up a little bit, but it didn't blow up. And it's the way it goes. Your best work sometimes, and I find that in my personal paintings as well. My favorite work is the things that are the ones that people don't like, and then I do something that I think, yeah, and then people rave about it. So you never know, do you, as an artist or even a teacher, which things people are going to gravitate towards. But I was quite happy with this one. It's a bit different.
Yeah, it's cool. Is it? Do you have any like sections on your channel for, like, tutorials that were slightly older ones that, like, tutorials you should not miss? Because this would be something I think a lot of people would be really interested to hear you
Yeah, I have created
teach. That's
like
not your
playlists.
normal
Yeah.
style.
I do have different playlists that might be worth digging through. I have to say, I've not really organized them recently. They're a little bit chaotic, and I could probably do with just giving it a bit of an overhaul and creating some brand new playlists in order to separate the different subject matter. And it's something I might return to doing again. I mean, I don't want to do the same tutorial again, But if I can find a different way of doing it or something similar, then I may return to this type of subject. I don't want to get into the mouth or the nose or the ear. I don't really want to go down that path really. Um, there are lots of really good drawing teachers and anatomy teachers out there, I think, on YouTube, and I think it's quite
Mm.
a well saturated market, as is landscape for that matter. But landscape is what is my comfort zone, is what I like to do. And I think that's why people come back to me as well. So, as much as I like to throw in the odd change to the subject matter, I don't see myself pursuing too many of these. But yeah, it's one I really enjoyed, and I think if people are looking for something a bit different, they might want to turn to that as well.
One thing I really like that you've done through the two different versions here is the first part where you've got just the iris. Your lighting is in the top right of the eye, and then you
Oh
appear
yeah,
to have
yeah,
either just
shifted it.
completely ditched it completely because the second one doesn't look like that. There's not as many eyelashes through it, and your
It's true.
lighting changes quite a bit on the second one compared to the first.
It's true. I did the iris and thought it looked good. It looked nicer tilted off to the the top right corner, and then I realised when you have an actual eye, then it doesn't make as much sense because the shadow of the eyelid would cover the top section of it more squarely and more evenly across. So yeah, I
Yeah,
amended it slightly. I also give a slight suggestion of kind of structural element there, almost like there's a window or something like that in the reflection of the whole eye, where it's a little less apparent in the just the iris one. So yeah, there are some subtle differences there, sure.
it's very
And how
cool
about
to
your?
see that you can pass across two different styles, though, two different subject matter as well, and yeah, still be able to create something of such detail as well. It must be
I
fun as
think
well. It's always fun to do
yeah,
variety, isn't it?
it is, and I think that if you enjoy drawing and painting, for me, I can enjoy drawing almost anything. I think that for me, it's a collection of colours and shapes and textures, and it almost doesn't matter what it is. The only thing that frustrates me with drawing faces is that then you have an extra level of what does that person look like, and I don't really like that because then it goes to the nth degree. It becomes about emotions and expressions and what does the person look like rather than just the
Yeah.
face. And I think it's that level that puts me off a little bit. But yeah, I do enjoy drawing a whole host of different types of subjects. Um, yeah, I just don't want to get too much down the drawing expressions and emotions. I find it very
Yeah.
frustrating.
It's definitely a big world to learn as well. All the different rules, etc. Like
Yeah,
the eye line lining up with the top of the ears. Little things like that. There's so many different rules, isn't there?
definitely. So, what about your fourth image then? I was looking at the list that you gave me, and you've got a picture of a colour bird as your fourth. So, tell us about
Yeah,
that.
number four is it's a YouTube tutorial. It's a red
Hmm.
cardinal. This is one of three bird paintings I've done. They all have the same brushes that I use, and it's a design that's we've done it. We spoke about it in a previous show about using the grid method of,
Yeah,
a 8x4 grid and then replicating the left side on the right side with a sketch and so on. And I think sometimes for me, I find drawing realism in a sense because although that is for me that's the closest I get to realism, and as much as I want to get as close to it as well. Like to be fair, I do think I'm quite happy with it. I'm happy with all three
mm.
of them that I've done in that style. I've done a red cardinal again. That's this one that we're talking about on YouTube, a robin and a blue tit as well. But for me, yeah, it's the only tutorial kind of structure that I like to do realism because we for me we've said about it before. I tend to draw a bit more variations of styles week in week out on YouTube, and with all of these things, if you want to learn how to draw birds all the time, you really want to just draw birds all the time. You don't want to diverse from that too much. So you should, for us it's kind of tricky to I like to tip my toes into these other things, but I also want to try and give it as much as I can. So the grid
Yeah,
method for me and replicating a photograph for me is still as rewarding, especially the end result, because this is a crop then of the canvas, so the right side of the canvas, to just this one. One thing I always really like about doing these as well is just giving the background a really light wash with the watercolor brushes and just allowing we don't need to add any detail back there at all.
no,
We're simply focusing on the subject matter and creating the bird actual the layering of all of those feathers that takes so much time. And This one is very much one of those processes where I always say, chuck the color in. We start off with basic shapes. What's the basic color of the wing? If you had to narrow down the whole wing to one color, what is it? The chest area, what's the darkest tone there? If you had to pick just one color again, what is it? And we layer on kind of the basic colors all right next to each other, and just slowly start to build up dashes after dashes. A lot of these have really high brush strokes, and especially at the end. My favorite part of this one, when you get right towards the very end, is adding in those white accents.
I was going to say, looking at the close-up detail of it, I can see that they're just really shining through. That looks really nice, textural level of detail on that.
And they're my favorite parts. It's that final last bit of just like the outlines of where the light's coming from the opposite side, and it's lighting up the feathers that you can just about see on the opposite side, giving it essentially a white outline, but also the ones that run through the chest as well, the separation of like the head and the neck to one another. The wings, I must admit, are a little bit tricky with this sort of style. I do find them a little bit tricky. The one part I just despise doing in these ones is the feet. I hate doing them. Bird feet are ugly as it is. To have to draw them and detail them as much as you can like that, it's not my favorite, I must admit, but a style that I want to do more of. I'll be honest, I wish I could almost do these every week. They take a lot of time to do, in terms of they're actually fairly large tutorials. I think the first one I did was, at the time, like one of the longer tutorials I did, and now I've gone way past that. But yeah, I'm really pleased with it. One thing I want to kind of put, I said in the intro, is about looking at the things you could probably improve. Underside of the wings towards the rear. At that point, I must admit, while I was going through the tutorial, I was like, do you know what? I want to wrap this. Like I'm everywhere else looks great, but the underside of these wings, I just want to block them in, and I never gave them any detail. And it's like the far side of the bird, but the underside. So it's okay because it's somewhat in the shadows, but in reality, I must admit, at the time I was like, I just want to get past this now. But I don't think it does any negative impact really necessarily on the rest of it as
painterly
well.
kind of dissolving out there at the bottom area anyway, isn't it? So it's quite forgiving, that, and it looks great as an image. I don't think that the eye is drawn to that, and although you may see it critically and you may identify an issue, I don't think that the general viewer of it is going to see it in that way. It does look very good. I like the textures.
Thank you. Yeah. I love doing that effect. I find myself lately doing it all the time, of putting those mask style frames around the outside. When I'm doing them, I always explain it's as if you've just peeled up some masking tape from your painting, and you're left with the edges, and maybe the masking tape wasn't as premium as it should have been, and so you end up with some rough edges. I love that. I think they always look great, especially if you pick like a canvasy style texture color for the background. I think they look good. I think I also, in a few of the previous ones, I provided like a canvas texture brush as well to try and elevate it to that more painting style. But in this one, I didn't do that. I wanted to simply just keep the colors as close to the photo as possible. It's really interesting actually, because the wash in the background, just the green, is just like 3 or 4 green hues. But in the design, I think you start off and you do it really lightly, and towards the end, I'll say, okay, at this point, because you've done the outline of the bird, you can duplicate it if you want to, and layer it up, and it gets much more saturated. And you can kind of duplicate it maybe 2 or 3 times, and it makes the background really realistic, with that really soft, shallow depth of focus. But I try to keep them to a more subtle, muted color palette a lot of the time, so that we can focus our attentions on the subject matter.
Do you remember what your main brush was for that? The texture, like the feathers and the little tiny hairs on it.
It's only ever 2 brushes.
Right.
There's the wash brush for the background, and the other one is the wet sponge. The wet sponge does the whole bird. There's only 2 brushes ever used for it. And I actually really like that, because I know the formula then going forward, and I've done that in all 3 of the bird tutorials now. So I know the formula of the brushes doesn't change. I know the format of just essentially getting more granular with detail over time. And I think that's one less thing to then worry about. It's just, okay, we don't need to worry about the brush. We just make it smaller as we go. Just focus on color and application.
I think there's a lot of brushes like that, because especially when you reduce it down to like 1% or something, it just becomes a thin line, doesn't it? And it has a very different quality as a brush as when it's larger and you can see all the individual textures. I often find that one brush can be extremely versatile and used in so many different ways. Yeah.
One tutorial you've picked for your third spot is one that just stood out to me from last year, and that is your snowflake design.
Sure. Yeah, no, it was one I was really happy with. I mean, it's quite seasonal one. It's not one that's going to draw attention all year round, but I really love the seasonal tutorials we have. It's one thing that I do like to do when it comes. I get excited coming around to Christmas time because I think, well, I can really dig deep into these subject matter again.
It's
Excuse me, and I
great to,
really
for all of
enjoyed.
the seasons, isn't it? Because you can do it for
Yeah,
Halloween. You can do it. It's like a break from the norm, isn't it, for
yeah.
us?
I get a little bit. Not, but I certainly don't get bored of the summer. But I run out of ideas through the summer. I've done a beach. I've done a summer field. I've done
Yeah,
trees and lots of trees and more flowers, and I get a little bit stuck for ideas. I've been trying to mix them up a little bit, but yeah, come the winter time, there doesn't seem to be any shortage of kind of subject matter. So the snowflake was one that I hadn't done before, and I really liked changing up the scale. So from large landscapes where obviously all you see is the mountains and the rivers and the trees, so just going on like a microscopic level pretty much. And it's a little bit off because the snowflake itself is a tiny minuscule thing, and then it's sat on a ground with, but it doesn't matter. It's a little bit of player perspective, but the overall look of it, I was really happy with the kind of the realism of it, the lighting of it. But more than that, I found the technique of drawing a line, doing the little blocks of texture on it on like a mirror line. So I did the mirror line, did the little rectangles that would all spike out on either side of it, and then I would duplicate it. And I noticed on the rotate that you can, if you put it, I think it was on transform, and you can do it manually. You can see the amount of degrees. It's something I'd not really clocked before, but I noticed you can just rotate it by 45 degrees, and that will give you the next angle, and then rotate it by 45 degrees, and it will give you the next one, and then layer them all together, and then you get some really amazing sort of patterns start to emerge in the central area. And then it was just a question of bringing in some textures and concentrating on putting little points of light in the right place, putting the light on the right sort of facets of it, the right angles of it. Not the right angles, you know what I mean, the correct angles of it. Um, and then also, the version that I'm showing you now is the extended version. So I played around with the perspective blur around the edges, so it just has a shallower depth of field and a slight out of focus feel to it for the background and around the edges, as well as the bokeh kind of light effect around the upper
yeah, yeah.
area, and a little bit of a cool mist kind of drifting down from the top area as well. It's just one that I really enjoyed doing, and I really enjoyed as well seeing other people's versions, because just like we know all snowflakes are unique, um, people following the same process and technique felt that they had a little bit of freedom to play around with the little rectangles and the structural parts of each strand, each branch of the snowflake a little bit differently, and then it
I was
just
going to say
magically
that.
created new forms. It was amazing really to see the variation.
I was going to say this was everywhere, and exactly like as you said, everybody's. There was a certain element of kind of playing around with it and experimenting, which you don't
Yeah,
always get in our tutorials, where you draw that main first part, and then when you rotate it all the way around, what do you get? And everybody's
yeah.
looked slightly different, which I thought was awesome to see. And
It's
again,
just
this
like
was
the
absolutely
paper
everywhere.
thing. Do you remember the paper?
Yeah,
You fold the paper up and you cut the
yeah,
shapes
yeah,
out and you open it. Everyone's is different. And it was the one tutorial where the differences were celebrated rather than, oh, I did it wrong, it didn't look like the original. People would
yeah.
take joy in the fact it looks a little bit different, and be excited to see what their version looked like compared to yours. Um, and there weren't many that looked the same. In all honesty, they all looked a little bit different right from the outset because the structure was different, and just I really enjoyed doing that one. There was also a couple of different techniques I used. I think it was the chromatic aberration, where the colors shifted a little bit and it just brought out some extra colors. It's quite subtle, but it's not quite monochrome. It's not just the blues. It's got hints of kind of greens and yellows, especially when it's zoomed in. It's just got a little bit of vibrancy, almost like the when you shine light through a prism, and it kind of all the light colors sort of separate. And it just had a hint of that in there, which I was really quite pleased with. The using digging deep into Procreate and using some of those tools just to come up with something a little bit different. A lot of my tutorials tend to be, or certainly in the past, a lot of them have been preferencing sort of hand drawing skills. And I think this was an example where I've just dug a little bit deeper into the tools and really have enjoyed seeing what the tools of Procreate can actually do. And I've kind of continued along that path. I mean, we'll get to it, but in almost all of my tutorials now, I'm using the alpha lock, I'm using the clipping mask, I'm using the different sort of filters and effects that you can come up with within Procreate, rather than shying away from it and being quite purist. Because I come from a traditional painter's point of view. I think, well, if I couldn't do it with a brush and acrylic paint, therefore I'm not doing it. But I kind of loosened up a little bit on that, and I don't see it in quite the same way that I used to. So yeah,
I remember when
it's
you
changed and
released
adapted.
this. I remember when you released this. So you say about, everything I normally see from you is hand drawn. Like you draw every element of it. When I
Yeah,
saw this, I was like, there's no way he's drawn all of it. I remember
no,
I remember sitting down. I was like, I've got to watch this because, like you say about the lighting effects and the splitting of it in that prism style effect. I was like, there's no way you sat through and drawn each one of
no.
those elements with a red and a green. And I was so fascinated to know how you'd done it. And I also think with these types of tutorials, it really gives off that like impression, I think, to a lot of viewers of like, wow, this person really has a full understanding of all the tools that Procreate has. And they were like, oh, I need this one thing to look a certain way. Oh yeah, just use
Yeah,
the chromatic aberration, like, I think that's what it is. Um, you know,
yeah,
it gives the illusion of like mastery almost of the tools available, and be like, oh yes, okay, we'll just use this. I know how it's going to be used and utilized perfectly. But yeah, I
yeah.
remember watching it and be like, no way is he drawing all that. It's such a great result. It looks, the macro style of it as well, and the blurring of the ground it was so good, and the fact that there was so much room for um exploration of people watching it and being able to draw whatever they wanted to draw is awesome, and come up with what patterns they want to see.
Thank you. I feel like I should have put that higher up on my list now that you've picked it up for me.
Well,
Thank
the
you.
thing is as well, like when you see so many, like your normal stuff, when you see the seasonal stuff, you can have fun and, like you said, a bit
Yeah,
artistic liberty of like a giant snowflake in the snow. But you can have fun with it, and I think that's sometimes what's missing a lot of the time is the fun
sure.
part. So when you do something like that, it's just nice and creative, isn't it? It's just something
Yeah,
different.
definitely. So what about your what number are we up to now? Are we on the third?
We're
We're
up
on the
to number
third, yeah.
3. We are
So your
indeed.
third image is the kind of subject matter that I'm more familiar with. So I feel more on my home sort of turf here, where I can, really dig deep into the kind of subject matter. So tell us about your third.
So this one is here for another reason, as well as the fact I love this one. This was my 100th Patreon exclusive tutorial.
Right.
So for me at that point, I'd been looking at like the number and the quantity of how many are there, and you kind of we've said a little bit in the last episode about kind of setting your own kind of targets and reward points, and like trying to achieve certain things. And hitting 100 was good for me because I wanted to have that catalog, sat
Yeah.
behind it. And for this one as well, I normally have the phrase, don't get lost in the details. Zoom out, don't get lost in the details. You don't need to over detail too much. This one, I said it straight from the outset. I said, we are going to get lost in the details. We're going to do as much as we can with as much time as you can give to it. And
Yeah.
um, each tier, as it makes its way back, does have that element to it. The hillside right in front of us, the small amount of aurora brush, I think it was, that I was using for like the granular pieces of like
Mhm.
nature. It's almost kind of got that, I don't really know how to describe it really, but like almost like a natural overgrown mossy style environment to it,
Yeah.
which I wanted to portray a lot of, that there is a lot of vegetation here, but with the hillside path. The path as well for me is it's something that I actually really enjoy drawing a lot, like these dirt paths, because all you need to do is just draw some grooves in from either side, a dash of darkness here and a dash here, and it's just the bumps and lumps of the uneven ground, that how the dirt's been compacted in some areas and not in other areas, and then a little bit of lighting on the top. And I think a path like that, it's just such a simple thing, but if you just left that plain with some beige tones and they get lighter as they go around the corner, for me it doesn't have the same effect. And then the grassy kind of elements on the side of the path on the left, I think that again was Aurora and slowly making the brush smaller and smaller and smaller as we make around the corner, as well as a dry ink brush as well. to create like grassy style blades through the actual sort of vegetation there as well, which I really enjoyed. One thing I really tried to nail as well, which I'm fairly pleased looking back at it again now, is the kind of lighting, how the lighting is
Yeah,
beyond the other side of the hillside we're on,
it's really
and
effective. Yeah,
therefore how does it affect the lighting on the right hand side of the scene where it's in the shade. And that's something that's like those color trying to find the right color to give off
mm.
the impression, but it's still vegetation, so it still needs to be green. It doesn't need to be too overly muted, if that makes sense. And then as you
Yeah,
wrap around the corner, you build up those tones. um and then the actual sort of secondary element to it, almost the main subject, I guess, was the quite steep um, cliffside that on the left side must drop down into just like oblivion, because it just seems to just like a sheer drop. But on the right side, it's got all the vegetation on it as well. So I actually duplicated the trees on the very top on that left piece of stone, and used them at the very bottom in the bottom left hand corner as well,
yeah,
right at the very end of the tutorial, just to kind of, I wanted to show elevation and height. So if the tips of the trees are down there, how high are we right now on this hillside path?
sure.
Because otherwise could it have been, if I'd have left that kind of hazy and white, would it have maybe even just looked like a lake or some water just very close to this path? So therefore is the path, just beside a lake of some sort. I wanted to try and make sure, we are up in the heavens here, right
Yeah,
above everything. One thing I think in hindsight, looking at it, we've got one, two, three, four, five different hillsides rolling back into the distance. If I think in hindsight, I'd have loved to have done something you did in your first tutorial that we showed here with the mountain scene, of at least on that what the first element, the first hillside of those hillsides at the back there. So the first set of color there, I'd have loved to add some more just hues and changes in lighting there, just to give off some impression of like a hillside that has trees on it as well. I think what I was going for is that it's miles away. It's really
yeah.
far away, so you can't add too
I
much. But I
think
think
that
in hindsight, I would have.
I think it conveys that, and also there's the image. I think is successful because it relies on the edge just catching the light, doesn't it? Rather than
Yeah,
the a full flat face of it with all of its colours and textures being revealed. It's a thin slice of just the hint of the edges of each little roll of texture just catching the light in a really nice way. And I love the fact that you've got really vibrant greens in the foreground and cooler greens in the slightly middle distant mountain, and then cooler colours. I mean, it's just colour perspective, but I always find colour perspective really satisfying when it's done, correctly and accurately and nicely. And I think it really works nicely on this image, and really, I think it's really nice. And I also like the way that the sunlight's just sort of like bleaching out the leaves. I think it's something that a lot of people don't do and don't get right, and I think it's really nice the way it just completely obliterates the the forms of the leaves. You really can't see them if you zoom in. Excuse my hands in front of the screen, but you zoom in there and it really has bleached out. And you've actually used, is it like an alpha lock, and then you've gone over some of that texture
yeah,
as well with a
exactly
lighter
that.
color. Yeah,
Yeah, because I think I've said it recently in a recording. I think sometimes we draw a tree how we like the tree, and then by not alpha locking it, you layer on too much more. You
yeah,
make it very dense. And one thing I'm lately doing more so than I was at the time of this one is trying to make trees, less cartoony. And yes, you can use a leather wood brush, but you'll make it too round.
yeah,
Leave big gaps in there. Let the tree breathe and let the branches breathe, and not try and create them too dense, like Christmas trees almost kind of vibe.
yeah,
That solid shape to it. So alpha locking it a lot of the time for me is the nice in between. You've drawn it how you like it to start with. Don't change the shape of it. Alpha lock it, add the color then onto the shape that you've already drawn, rather than
yeah,
really block it out and make it too busy. But you say about the lighting, that is one of my favorite parts of this. It's something I do quite a lot of towards the end of tutorials. I'll go in with like a very light orangey yellow tone with a large soft airbrush, and tap 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 on the screen and create that big orb of glow. And
it's
then
a nice effect,
from
isn't
there,
it? Yeah,
just try and you set it to overlay, I think, most of the time. And then just try and erase it from the areas you don't need. That
mm.
hillside on the right hand side, for example, that was completely erased from there. So it kind of pushed the light in kind of round the corner almost of our scene, and just again showed it on that opposite side, and then not necessarily in our face. It's one that I'm really happy with, and I think it's about you have an art of making things fairly quick for the level of detail required, but for me, I can't do that. And I think this one, I still think this might be the longest tutorial I've ever made. 2 to 3 hours, I think, off the top of my head. I cannot remember, but it's something around that mark. And I think for me, when I have something I kind of battle with about duration, but I actually just enjoy it so much. Of just like I'm
Yeah.
enjoying the process through it so much. I'm not. I think that gets lost in sometimes the recording of, you're not trying to focus to a goal. You're just here to draw. I'm here to draw for a bit, and if I'm getting lost in it while I'm drawing it, hopefully that comes across then in the final result of, this guy actually really sat through this, really, didn't speed ahead. I never necessarily make cuts. So for this one, they are sat with me drawing the same things over and
Yeah.
over, but I'm enjoying it hopefully as much as they are. So yeah, it's not just a task. We've got to get to the finish line. It's,
It's
let's
got to
sit
be the
through
main
this.
reason we do this, isn't it? If it isn't for the
Yeah,
enjoyment, there's not a lot of point, is there really?
exactly. So moving on into what is a fairly new one for yourself, which is your number 2 spot.
Yeah.
Is your What would you refer to this as? How would you? Is it a hut?
It's a kind of, I think I described it as a forest hut, but it's just a little kind of ramshackled cabin or hut within the kind of the woodland forest sort of scene. Um, yeah, and it's something that I've started to think along the lines of adding structural elements to my pieces more recently. I think I've done landscapes to death, and I'm not going away from landscapes, but I'm trying to think of ways that I can add new elements to them. And if it is just adding a little building or a little cabin or a bridge, I'm trying to find ways just to bring another dimension into them. It's the kind of thing that people have been asking me to do for about 5 years, and I've kind of stubbornly, not refused, but it takes a while for the cogs to kind of, move around to come around to the idea. Um, but yeah, I've finally got around to the idea of using more geometric structural elements within my pieces. And it's just one that I think we were talking a little bit before we started filming that we have a little bit bias towards our most recent tutorials. And it may be your paintings, your personal work as well. I think when it is a more recent piece, you feel that it's probably the best that you can do for now, and it's probably outdone some of your older pieces. Not always the case. Um, Sometimes your older work can just sort of be there to challenge you and damn you, and kind of you try and outdo it and you struggle. But most of the time, I think that our more recent images tend to be the ones that we like the best if we're continuing to push forward. And so yeah, I just find this an image. I like the sunny nature. I really wanted to capture a kind of height of summer, so with the lights really high up in the sky, um, really and a dappled light through foliage as well. I'm really enjoying doing tutorials where there's a dappled light coming through, and just the change that the impact it has on the color scheme
So
in the
explain a
shadow and
dappled
in the
light
light
then
areas.
to viewers then.
Do what? Sorry, explain it.
Yeah, explain the dappled light then to viewers. Just the differences in lighting is quite
Yeah,
important for people to understand and break down.
sure. So obviously, if you're in a shadowed area, then you'll have the same object, the same subject, but the light affects it differently. And when it's in the height of the sun, then it's going to be a lot warmer, more brightly saturated. And then in the shadow parts, it's not just going to be darker, it's going to be cooler colors. And I really enjoyed playing around with that. So, yeah, it might be on the ground where there's some stones making a kind of path of sorts, and you get a really bright. It's quite a cool color consistently all the way along in terms of the stones, but just a real sense of blue coming out in the shadow areas. The leaves and the foliage having a much more blue tone to them when they're in the shadows, and then contrasting that with a really vibrant zingy green to represent where the sun is just catching it. And I find that contrast really interesting. I've always been fascinated by high contrasts. So where you've got a really muted cool colors and then a really warm saturated color next to each other as well. Um, and this was a relatively, and I think the tutorial might be 50 minutes, an hour long or something, but there's a lot of texture in there and the leaves, and
Mm.
um, if you watch the tutorial, it's quite loosely applied, really. I'm not painstakingly drawing every leaf. The brush does a lot of the work. I mean, it's got layers to it. So there's the background trees, and then there's middle ground trees, and then there's foreground foliage. There's quite a few layers of different foliage types. But the brush itself, I think that was the rainforest brush in this example. I don't always use the rainforest brush for trees, but in this case, I did use the rainforest brush for actual trees. Um, I'm not for rainforests, but if you look at the brush, it almost looks like literally a rainforest that represents close up. It is the kind of shape of almost a full tree canopy. But when you reduce it down, as we were saying before, and then maybe go onto the brush settings and space it out and create more separation between those different elements, then you can use it for foliage and use it for individual leaves. And I just found it really satisfying to do so. And then we're looking at the extended version. I've also added some flowers. Now I do forget the name of the brush. I think it's the Currawong brush. It's not something I'd used before. But again, by separating it out into its individual little components, it just made some sort of random looking little shapes for the flowers as well. So yeah, just one. I really enjoyed the changing of light, uh, something a bit different in terms of the structural element. I have kept it quite hidden around the edges. I've created foliage that disguises the edges of the geometric shapes, as I didn't want to get too bogged down in making it perfect as a geometric object. And also, it's falling apart. It's got cracks all over it, and so it's quite loose and quite easy to achieve. And I've seen loads of people's examples that, they've, because it is quite loose, it still looked quite effective, I feel. So one I'm happy with on the whole.
Yeah, it's awesome. Do you always? I've noticed you is something that you do in your extended ones typically of adjusting the sort of focal length, because this one has a nice element where the bottom area, those flowers are slightly, in my opinion, somewhat out of focus compared to say the mid and the actual hut. Is that something you like to do as like an additional sort of extra step?
Yeah, I tend to do that. I often do that. I mean, it's just an extra finishing touch sometimes, especially because I think if things are too foreground as well, I mean, it's quite forgiving if you just have it a bit more out of focus. It not only represents the kind of photographic effect, but also when things are super in the foreground, then you're going to look for those individual separation of petals and specific leaf shapes. And it's a good way of just escaping that kind of trap, really, of having to spend 100 hours drawing every single petal and every single leaf detail. It creates a really nice photographic look, but it also just gets you out of the obligation of drawing those specific flowers and shapes. There are one or two tutorials where I have actually spent the time to really dig deep into those foreground flower shapes, but I prefer it when I don't have to. I like to be able to execute things in a kind of looser way, but still create that sense of realism. That's where I'm at my happiest, I have to say.
Yeah, I love it. It's ideal. Like you say, it takes away some of the requirements of you, and uh, the focus of this is not the foreground in a literal sense, and
No.
in the whole concept of the whole design. The main focus is the hut in the middle. So I say this a lot in tutorials. Don't you need to tell someone where to look, and those subtle focus effects very quickly tell your eye that's not where I'm meant to be looking. It's quite an interesting kind of bit of almost like psychology of it, of saying, where you should be looking and where you shouldn't be looking, and the
Yeah.
techniques involved to try and do something like that through just digital art as well. It's a lovely piece. It almost gives
Thank you.
me, and manga fans are probably going to hate me for it because I'm not educated in that space at all. But for some reason, it gives me a bit of a manga background scene. You know how
Yeah.
sometimes in like not so much cartoons, but sometimes the TV shows where the background, it very much in like the traditional Disney sense, where the background is a static image, and then you would have characters
Yeah.
walking in that kind of anime, more
Definitely. Yeah. Yeah.
bold aesthetic to it. I could definitely see two characters walking, from outside scene into scene and then walking towards the hut for some
I
reason.
think the
Yeah,
pristine blue and the very crisp white edges of the cloud and things like that. I really like kind
I
of
was going to
Studio
say.
Ghibli animation. Yeah, and it's definitely an influence. And when I find influences that I can bring in and inspirations, images that I might find out there that I can draw elements of those in, I do quite enjoy. and celebrate doing that. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it's a beautiful piece. Very
So
nice. And you
moving
say
on
about
to
talking about structures. Yeah,
your fourth
is
image, yeah, I mean it's quite similar in terms of being a structural element, isn't there?
yeah. So the first one is actually the daylight kind of scene. So this is my cabin in the woods tour. I think this is probably like number 50, maybe over on Patreon. I can't remember. Um, this one was really fun to make though, because just in my research and references, it was a combination of photographs. If I've got them still, I will put them up on screen as well. Um, of finding a cabin, little elements of landscape, and putting them together, like the river on the left hand side. These were photographs that I just very loosely cut around, drop them onto a canvas, and then use them as guides for the rest of the content. Um, yeah, I loved this one, and for me, it's kind of as what we were alluding to a second ago with the hut one of somewhat telling people where to look, but with almost a vignette instead. So not
Yeah.
so much just a full vignette around the outside. For people that are not sure what a vignette is, you can add like a dark or even a light border around the outside that kind of has like a soft airbrush to it, so that you're telling people, we're looking at here, what's in the center, or whatever point of perspective you want them to look at. Um, so this one's imagined that the sun's behind us a little bit. Now, I must admit, now I look at it, the lighting is all over the place, and I don't like it. But these are things you can only see months, if not, I think probably a year later. But yeah, no, I love this one. It was a matter of we said before as well of certain elements don't need maximum detail. So for me,
Yeah.
it was about nailing the cabin at the beginning and the land around it. I really enjoyed it. This I must give credit where credit is due. Um, you've used Leatherwood brushes many times, and I saw you use it, and I was like, I'm going to try and do that for the land as well. So you inspired the land here in terms of the variations in the colors and whatnot, and the leatherwood allowing you to build up all those tones by setting it to like a 50% or even lower, and just allowing it to constantly layer on top of itself. But when you
Yeah.
get two parts of the brush overlap itself, that part in the middle now becomes 40% in terms of
Yeah,
opacity,
sure.
because it builds up. And those techniques are really really cool in creating like a big detailed piece of land. And this is meant to be like a bit more of a spring style scene to it. We've got the lake on the left hand side, we've got the grass, we've got the path where I've tried to sort of incorporate it where people are walking through, and you've got little sort of divots in the ground, and potentially a driveway beside the actual cabin itself. And I was so pleased with the cabin itself as well. I was so pleased with the lighting on it and the detail, etc. And then just
Looks
keeping the
great.
trees a little bit towards the outer edges, a bit more simple. We've got blurred trees way in the distance, again, trying to just show content without having to, you don't need to detail things that are that far back kind of thing.
So which was the first version then? I mean,
It
does
was
it
the
work like
spring
that?
one.
The
Yeah,
spring one,
so
right?
so I had an idea, and I loved this tutorial so much, and truth be told, people liked it so much on Patreon. I thought, is there anything I can do with this? And you'll be able to see now on screen the second version of this. So it's a completely, you have to do the spring one first. It's not like one can
Right.
come in any order. It's spring one was drawn first, and then I was like, well, this scene is very warm. It's very, it's very much in that time period of year. This would be somewhat easy to change and give it that cabin in the woods, but in the middle of winter. So we duplicate the whole canvas of the first one. So you've got the first one still ready to go, and you can keep going back to that if you want. We duplicate the canvas fully, and then the first sort of, I think it was 10 to 15 minutes is adjustments in terms of,
Mm.
okay, let's go in, let's bring all the saturation down of all the layers. As we're now in this winter, more grey style scene, I very much wanted to focus on the lighting from the cabin only as the main color element. Let's bring everything down, and let's then get to work on layering on top some greys, some dark browns as well, to then create the ground again. And then remembering what we drew last time, can we then change it so we can show the actual paths of where people are walking more in the winter sort of snowy ground instead. So now you can see the pathways a lot more of the people walking through, because that's where their feet have been
Yeah.
constantly treading and compacting the snow down. The lake on the left hand side now is frozen, or having looked at it again, I would argue potentially it's either frozen or it's kind of got that when snow starts to melt or the snow falls in the water, gets a little
Yeah.
bit whiter and a bit grey almost. But yeah, just changed it up and wanted to add the snow on top. So for me, I really enjoyed. To be honest, this is the only time I've ever necessarily done this. Of taking a design completely and going, how can we do it again, but with something that's a little bit different, enough of a difference to
Yeah.
justify a second full tutorial. And my favorite part is definitely layering the snow on top of the cabin and the as if there's a log fire inside burning away, and you've got the smoke from the chimney as well.
It's really nice. It's very kind of, it's not like anything Bob Ross would necessarily do, but it's got that element of just an imaginary world where you can create your own little story and narrative of what's sort of taking place there. It's a really lovely little scene, and I can imagine it'd be really satisfying to sort of stop piling on the snow and building up those effects as well. And obviously, you've got the kind of falling snow layer on there as well, haven't you, to really kind of create that atmosphere, which is really nice.
Yeah, and that's one of those elements that we kind of spoke about. Of you can use something like the driven snow brush to, in a sense, also hide elements that you don't like of
Yeah,
the design, or you're adding, you're almost adding like an entire level of detail as an overlay to the whole design without
yeah,
having to meticulously go in and correct everything that you maybe don't like anymore. So yeah, I had good fun with it. I must admit I'd love to try and do something again with further planning. It's quite a big project in a sense to do
yeah,
that, but
definitely.
to draw something knowing that you could change it. I'm looking at the one we just did of your hut, and like my mind's running wild now with that one as well. Like how would that look in a scene like this, and having to do part one of the first one and then part two, and someone gets two completely different variations on it. I think it's definitely maybe
Yeah, it's
something
a
to
really nice
think
idea.
about.
Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, for sure. But maybe I'll do another one again. I did imagine doing more, but I thought the contrast between the summer and the winter was enough to then, well, we don't need to do an autumn one necessarily of the same scene again. And how would you do the hut differently, the cabin differently this time? The first summer version has no lights on because it's the middle of the day. The other one has the lights
Yeah,
on, so you've got the lighting coming through. You light up the underside of the roof, the overhang as well.
it would be
All of
quite a
those types
subtle
of things.
variation on the spring one, wouldn't it? It'd just be a shift of color, I guess, wouldn't it? Really?
It would. It would. So now we move into number one, our
Yes.
favorites of our tutorials. Now, again, yours is a fairly recent one as well, isn't it?
It is, yeah. We've had that kind of recent bias of a latest work, but it harkens back to the slight shift I've had in terms of introducing sort of structural elements. But one thing I really loved about this, in terms of the overall look on it, when I kind of zoom in on the leaf shapes, or rather the texture of the leaves, I use the noise filter. So I would duplicate once I created all the foliage and use the rainforest brush to create the different layers. And it's quite an involved process of building up the layers to begin with. But then I would duplicate the layer and then apply the noise filter. And it has to be done just so, because it's quite an ugly filter if you overdo it. If you put it on quite high, it's quite overbearing and quite powerful. But then just to find the right balance with the noise filter, increase the scale of it, the size of it, and it just kind of gives a real granular quality. And I think sometimes with some of the brushes is that they kind of get the impression there, but they don't get quite the sense that you've got lots and lots and lots of really fine little leaves in there. So I found it possible to create, like in the last image, a sense that you've got individual leaves, but it's quite close to us. But to use that technique and create something that creates a sense of a tree being much bigger, you almost have to reduce the scale of those individual leaves, and that's quite a trick to do, because they're trying to create the density of all of the leaves compressed together, and also try and create that sense of the the foliage and the tree being enormous. And I found by using the noise filter, it kind of nudged it in that direction in a way that I really enjoyed. And obviously, it's got the structural element, and similar to your last image in terms of it's got this wood cabin with the glow and the light coming through as well. I really enjoyed that contrast of a shady kind of dark area with a really just a punch of light coming out of the windows. and it's just one that set my imagination off going off as well. I really love doing trees, excuse me, just bang my microphone. Trees are probably my favorite subject to do, whether it's just sitting out in the wild and actually sketching them on paper, or sitting on my iPad, and I think it allows so much freedom just to experiment with the shape and just see what materializes, because you can really just create a tree. I mean, obviously it conforms to certain parameters. Your branches will typically have to get narrower and narrower as they go. Obviously, it's the way they grow. Um, the lighting conventions have to work in a certain way, but you can push your tree into almost any different shape that you want, really. And I really enjoy that. And I also enjoy just the effect of creating that kind of 3D-ness, and the cool light, and the backside of the tree textures being a kind of affected by the mist, and more muted and less saturated, and lighter in tone. It just gives that. I enjoyed creating that sense that it is not just a flat surface, not just the front textures, but then also that kind of the whole sense of the round shape, which I really enjoyed doing. And just the structural element, although when you zoom in, it's quite rough and quite ready, the little cabin, but with a little pinch of the liquify brush just to pitch those little textures into a little front triangle, at the front of that image. I just really enjoyed that image, and it's one of the ones that it's a recent image, so I might feel differently about it in another 6 to 12 months. But for now, it's the one that if I had to show somebody one of my tutorials and say, I'm really happy with this, and I think you'll like following along with it, and I think you'll be pleased with your results, this is the one that I would put in front of them at this point. The version on screen is the extended version. It's not vastly different. The only difference really in this extended version, because I was generally pretty happy with it. One of the difficulties I find with creating extensions on my main tutorial is when I'm really happy with the main tutorial, I struggle to know what to do to it. So I added a little boat and a few extra stones and ripples in the water and a few birds, but not much else actually to the extended version. So the version you're seeing now is pretty much the main tutorial version, and just one that I'm probably one of the most proud of this as an image and also as a tutorial, because there's two different elements, I guess, isn't there? There's the image, and we can like the image we've produced, but do we like the way that we've taught it? Do we feel that people can follow it? Is it clever in some of the techniques and the tools, and is it offering something different, um, than perhaps people would think of? Because if we're just showing off in a sense, and saying, look, I can draw really detailed things and I can do it well, but people can't replicate that, then we've not really served our purpose as a teacher. And with this one, I've seen loads of different versions, and I've been impressed time and time and time again by the versions that other people are doing. So yeah, I'm quite happy with this one as a whole.
It's awesome to hear. You are. I can hear it in your voice and the way you describe it of how happy you are with the design as well. That again, like you said, sometimes when you're under the cosh and you're creating a recording, sometimes they don't work out 100% how
No.
you'd like them to. But unfortunately, you have to roll with it. So to get a gem as well of a design and be so happy with the result, and as you said, to be able to say this is what I do on YouTube, that's so awesome
Yeah.
to hear. It's just that you're so proud of it, and I love it. I love the happiness. I think there's a certain element of fantasy to this. I think
Yeah,
you've
definitely.
started to lean there a little bit in some recent months in a few different designs, and I really like that. It's like a subtle level of fantasy that's still that landscape main core to it still, but you are creating elements that are maybe not of normal form, but have
Yeah.
a really beautiful fantasy element to them. The lighting, as you say, on the actual hut itself as well, that little sparkle, that little glow as well, is just so nice against those bluer, tones of the tree, especially on the rear of the tree as well. So it just helps it pop even more. I must admit, the noise effect that you've used in the leaves, again, as you said, because it's so far away, to use the
Yeah.
noise and get the right level of grain in there, you almost go from you've used the rainforest brush and created, I would argue, like, version one of it, and then you've layered it, you've magnified the amount of detail by adding that noise effect on top, and you've really escalated it to a point where it looks like someone would have meticulously sat there and gone
Yeah,
for
that's what I was
hours
after.
on end. And there's so many tools, as we say, like that. If you can work out just a quick and easy way to, use them,
Yeah,
and it's you've still had to do, going back to what I was just saying, you could still have to do 90% of the work in this
of
instance,
course,
but
yes.
the noise just gives it that extra detail. But there's so much you still have to do. So
Yeah,
these are one of those things that I would argue and urge our listeners and viewers of our tutorials as well, try to break down, how someone's utilized that, and maybe even make note of it somewhere. If that's something you draw a lot all the time, distant foliage, make sure you make a note of these type of very small techniques that can really escalate the design and the detail to
yeah.
the next level. The rocks on that left hand side, by the way, they're tiny little rocks, but they look fantastic against the real gray sort of teal reflection of the water. It looks awesome. Those little fine, when you've
Okay.
got something that's got so much blur in terms of the background, those things in the main focal area that are still in focus are just those extra little touches that just make it look so good and detailed and crispy. And I think crispy is the perfect word, because again, it's like emphasizing this is the focal area. These
Yeah,
elements you can now see, and there may be rocks way in the distance that you can't see now because they're just simply lost to the focus
and
of the design.
lost in the mist as well. Yeah, absolutely. And
It's
speaking of
awesome.
fantasy, your number one, we've definitely got a fantasy element coming in there as well, haven't we? Which is really
Yeah,
nice to see.
definitely.
It's a really, really interesting image to tell us about that.
This one, uh, there was a phase where I wanted to start introducing. I think I'm a lot like yourself. We do landscapes quite frequently, or you way more than me. But doing landscapes so often, you kind of go, well, what's new that I can do? What's
Mm.
cool? And I think I kind of used the word cool when I was trying to sort of do research for it. Of like, what would be really cool? What would be somewhat different? So I wanted to create a skull monument, and at the time, this was like the second version I've kind of done of this kind of aesthetic where you've got trees at the foreground that are blurred out with the vines wrapped around them. And again, in hindsight, I maybe wouldn't have blurred everything quite so much, but I really wanted the focus just to be on
Yeah,
that element in the center. The concept being is this like skull style monument, deep in a woods that's got some sort of, either you can go down into some sort of cave and there's a magical element to it, and the glow brightening up from the inside, which is somewhat the throat almost of the skull design. And I wanted it to have that kind of ancient ruin style look to it as well. This one
yeah,
took a long time to make because we drew each one of those bricks in individually. Then we covered over a lot of them in terms of the green that grows around the top of the skull, and then going back through each one and introducing cracks. If I can zoom in the post, we can see in some of the cracks in the actual sort of socket area. There's a dark line cut through there, and then I went straight back over with the same color of the actual stone to give it a kind of indent crack,
yeah,
hairline crack almost aesthetic to it. So there's lots of extra elements the further you actually zoom in, and they're very apparent in the sort of headstone at the very top of the skull as well. There's like some sort of symbol like pattern in there as well. But it's a part of the kind of fantasy element that I'm enjoying. I've done different elements of what I refer to now as magic, and that is literally like a light pen to create like glowing kind of
yeah,
bugs or just dots of just magic floating in certain areas.
yeah,
And it's more apparent in like tutorials that I think I'm going to really be releasing next month on Patreon, which is kind of taking this kind of design concept a bit further again, and it's like in the deep woods again, but learning from the things I've done in something like this in the past, and then working out what I don't want to do next time, and also how to add more magic. Because I'd love to go back in, if I'm honest, and spend another half an hour to an hour on this, adding in dots of magic just floating around that entrance, and just extra little elements, maybe even some sort of like symbols in the stone somewhere, just like glowing. You could enter so much into it, but that's where you can get lost in these designs, can't you?
It's nice
In
to let your imagination go, isn't it? And just let it rip a little bit. It is really good fun.
Yeah, definitely. And I think I did another skull style related design as well, somewhat after this. So it kind of opened a door, really, because I think sometimes I also want to try and test to see how the audience kind of takes a certain design and see if it's horrifying and people don't like it, then fair enough. I won't do it again. But if people really respond to it and enjoy it, which a lot of people did, then I was like, okay, cool. This I kind of you almost create like a list now of options of going, okay, maybe, okay, I know that went down well. I won't do it straight away. We don't want to bore people, but I've got elements now I can go
Yeah.
to and sort of bring into future designs. I'd have loved to have done that noise effect with the grass across the top of the head. I would have definitely done that. Had you
I
have
really
done the
like
tutorial a little
the
bit earlier.
I really like the lighting around the kind of the eye sockets and the nose there. It looks really 3D, really punchy. I really like that. So how's what's the luminosity of that created through the special on the right eye socket? Do you remember? Is there a different blend mode or
I would imagine it was an add blend mode
yeah,
set to something very low, but just enough that it doesn't sit just on the stone. It's very much like bright and sort of, if
yeah,
not, you would argue in real life, kind of deflecting right at us.
yeah?
And then you're getting that kind of loss of the shape, but enough that you can still see it, but there's a definite glow there. And I think
It's nice.
for me, those types of aesthetic, it's on the stones as well at the top right of the sort of
Yeah,
head. That kind of loose glow to it hopefully emphasizes that kind of fantasy style element where there are magical elements at play as well at the same time, which I just think is cool. I'm happy with the contrast of lighting between the two sides as well, slightly darker left side to the right side, showing how that light is beaming in through the woods. And
yeah,
yeah, I think with all of these, I think you can give cool stories to them, which, take it beyond just what the design is. Does this monument only glow at a certain time of day when the sun's at a certain point and at a certain time of year? It's something like that. Otherwise, it's just a normal boulder set of boulders, maybe. I don't know. But I actually created an animation with this as well because the other elements in the background are so heavily blurred. I created a very simple animation where the skull was getting slightly closer, but then the foreground was coming at us a bit more pace,
very
and the
cool. Yeah,
background was shrinking at the same time. So you've got this kind of like dolly zoom kind of effect in
yeah,
where you felt like you were being brought in towards it, which I think I think with certain designs with what we do, I think if you layer a design in a certain way, I'm just scrolling back through different elements, which if I go all the way back to your first one, I think sometimes there's certain, if you can isolate each layer of a design, keep the main ones where they are, and then push the background backwards and then bring the foreground towards you, we can create very subtle levels of animation to this that maybe
yeah,
just make the piece look a little bit more alive. And I remember doing it at the time and thinking, I'm going to do that more often in tutorials when there's a certain, like, that definite separation between each layer, or
yeah.
like midground, foreground, and so on. Of just adding maybe just a quick animation at the very end. So maybe I'll try and revitalize that now I've actually thought about it. This has been really fun, to go back through some of these. I
Definitely.
think it's really cool to see maybe where we were at certain points in different journeys, different styles that we are also doing. And yeah, it's really
We've
interesting
enjoyed
to see
it
the
anyway, haven't
different.
we?
Yeah,
Hopefully, other
well, yeah.
people find it
No
interesting
one's listening
too.
anymore, so it doesn't really matter. But no, I think it's so cool, and to see the different styles, the elevation,
Yeah,
the change in style over time, and also the shortcuts that you eventually learn by creating quite so often as well.
definitely. Yeah, you do because all your years of experience just they mount up, and you find all sorts of little tricks and techniques, and you find more efficient ways of achieving something. Like I think just to track your progress as a teacher and as an artist, because you have to learn so much in order to teach it. And if I wasn't forced to sit here, I say forced, but if I didn't have the time scale in which every Sunday I have to upload, I probably would procrastinate and I wouldn't do as many images. Over the course of a year, I'm doing 52 paintings, whereas I wouldn't do otherwise,
Yeah,
probably. I might spend longer on each one, or I might have a big gap between them. So I think just the fact that you can look back a year ago and you've done 52 pieces since then, um, and just you can really chart the progress and see, how much as an artist you've improved is really satisfying as well. Um, but yeah, we're constantly evolving. We don't know everything yet, do we? And it's good to look back and just realize, that we are learning and we are gaining extra knowledge and we are continuing to strive to get even better still.
It's something I've
Always.
done in the past as well. I went back to, I think it was when the channel was 3 years old, and I went back to the very first tutorial I made and said, right, I'm going to redo it.
Yeah.
Let's use the same palette and concept, and let's just do it again. Let's really
Yeah.
up it. Let's have some fun with it. And so maybe we could go back to some of these older designs and go, with what we've learned, could we do something a little bit more advanced this time? Take it in a different direction, or just give it a different daytime type of lighting,
Yeah.
year type of lighting, and so on. There's so many options, and I think sometimes a lot of people in our space maybe don't do that enough. I think we can afford to go backwards and go, right, okay, that was a
Yeah.
lovely concept. Just because you've done the concept once doesn't mean you have to bin it once it's done.
No.
Go back and do it again and go, well, hang on, I've learned so much. Let's do
Yeah.
it again. Let's have some fun. Let's take it in a different direction and use the concept again. There's so much that we could do. Guys, if you
Definitely.
are watching and you have sat through an hour and 20 minutes of me and James just talking about our favorite tutorials, then we thank you so much. And if you have, put a dolphin emoji in the comments down below, and we'll know that you were right here till the very end. James, thank you so much as always, mate, for an
Thank
awesome
you.
conversation. And thank you to you for watching through this very long episode. We hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to subscribe to the channel for weekly episodes of the Sketchwave, and there's also links to our socials in the description down below.